Welcome to Disciple Dojo. We're continuing our walk through the lyrics of the Psalms. And so as we jump in, if you haven't already, we would really love if you would hit that subscribe button. Summer is actually pretty slow for YouTube viewership and video clicks and all that kind of stuff. So any little bit of support you can give us actually really helps Disciple Dojo. And when you do, enable notifications, that little bell icon, that's how you know not only when new Disciple Dojo videos are coming out, but whenever we make an announcement for when we're going to do our next Open Mat live stream or giveaways of the various study Bibles and other resources, which we're going to be doing some of those this summer. So be sure you have notifications enabled when you subscribe, and that, again, just really helps this channel. All right, let's jump into Psalm 14. As always, I'm going to read it in the old NIV, and then we're going to look at it in the original language and some of the translations over the centuries and see what we can find. Psalm 14, for the director of music, of David. The fool says in his heart, there's no God. They're corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There's no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. Will evildoers never learn? Those who devour my people as men eat bread and who do not call on the Lord, there they are, overwhelmed with dread. For God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come from Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. So this is the short psalm, only 7 verses. Let's take a look at it a little bit closer. And so you can see the Hebrew on this side, and then my woodenly literal English translation on this side. And it begins with a very short superscription, Lemnatseach David. For the, and we've never translated Natseach. Some have translated director, some translated for the end, and we leave it untranslated here in the dojo because we don't really know what this means. But this is a Davidic psalm. Again, whether that means David wrote it or whether that means it's written to David or as in the style of a Davidic psalm or whatever, this Le David is just a very generic Le. This Hebrew letter can mean to, toward, by, for, according to. It's just got a range of meanings, but very short superscription. And then it begins, Amar Nabal Bilbo Ein Elohim. Literally, says the fool. And this Nabal, there's a guy in 1 Samuel named Nabal. He was Abigail's husband. And part of that story, if you remember, is he acts the part of a fool. And Abigail even says to David, forgive my husband, he's a fool, just like his name. This is the word for fool. Now, there's another word that's used in the wisdom literature as well for fool, kasil, which sort of means like stupid person or dullard. Nabal, from what I can tell, has more of a connotation of like a brute, a fool, a moron, somebody who, and also that acts in that way. It's not just talking about what they know intellectually. They're unethical. Their behavior. So fool it's a loaded term, this word Nabal, but it's not just talking about someone's intellectual capability. It's talking about their behavior. And so a fool says, Belibo, in his heart, and this is the word for heart, mind, inner self. So you could say the fool says to himself. To speak in your heart is like to say something inwardly, or to believe in your heart, like to speak in your heart is who you are at the deepest level. So at the deepest level, inwardly, what the fool is saying is Ein Elohim. And this word Ein, this is just the particle of negation. It is just, there is not. So you could translate this as there is no God, like maybe he's making a philosophical atheistic claim, but contextually, it's more like God's not here. God's not involved. God's not around. Like for the purposes of me, there's no God. So it's someone who acts as if there is no God. And this is kind of indicative of all of those who are in rebellion against God, whether they claim to follow God, whether they claim to follow other gods. In their behavior, their actions are actions that say Ein Elohim. Like God's not factored into this. So because of that, they have ruined. They acted abhorrent of deed. No one, there's that particle again, Ein, there is not Oseh Tov, one doing good. So they say there is no God, and as a result, the psalmist says there is no good doers, people doing well, doing good. tov. So this is the situation of the psalm. Let's look at how other translations handle it. Like some English, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. And I like that they use abominable deeds here to translate hith ivu, because this is a form of the word, the same word that's translated as abominations in the Torah, like certain behaviors that God says, you shall not do these. This is abomination in my eyes. This is that same word. So they have done that. They have acted, they've committed abominable aliyah, deeds or acts or works. And this word that I translated that they have ruined, it's translated in some as, they are corrupt. NIV, they are corrupt. All of the major evangelical translations, they use corrupt. NASB, Holman. The Septuagint, though, translates they destroyed. And it's because this word, shachath, normally means to destroy, to exterminate. So corruption is, technically, yes, that's what the psalmist is probably referring to. But to me, it carries the sense, I think a better way of getting it is ruin, because you can ruin yourself or you can ruin something by destroying it or whatever. And when God sent the flood on the earth, it's because mankind had ruined their way upon the earth. So God said, I'm going to therefore send ruin upon the earth. And that's what you have in Genesis 6. Right here, God says, now look, I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Well, that's this word, shachat. To ruin. So yeah, it's not wrong to translate it as they have become corrupt, or they have corrupted themselves. But to me, it's a little more impactful, and it links it to the flood and to those early chapters of Genesis, which I don't think is coincidental, because God is in the next verse going to look down upon, just like he did at the flood, just like he did at Babel. So that's why I translated it as they have ruined. So that's the state that the psalmist is bemoaning. This is a lament because people are acting as if there is no God. Their behavior is reflecting that. This is a dominant theme throughout the Bible. When people act as if there is no God, it's the opposite of John Lennon's Imagine song. You can imagine what it's like if everybody believes there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no God. You want to imagine what that's like? The psalmist is saying, well, it's like a ruined earth with people behaving corruptly and everyone looking out for themselves. That's what it's like when people act as if there is no God, whether they say they believe it or not. So verse 2, Yahweh from heaven looks down upon Bnei Adam, the sons of humanity or human beings. We've seen this phrase before, just a regular way of referring to mortals as opposed to God. And he looks down upon them to see hayesh, and this is the opposite. It's there is. And this means it's a question. So Yahweh looks down from heaven upon the sons of humanity to see, is there understanding, maskil? Doresh et Elohim, is anyone seeking God? So is there understanding, seeking God? It's like God's looking. And verse 3, no. Hakol sar, everyone turned away, yahdao, together. So collectively, all of humanity, they are corrupt. And this is, unlike shachath, which is translated as corrupt by English translations, this is the word for to spoil or to sour, like of milk, if milk goes bad. And so everyone's corrupt in the sense it's an image of being morally corrupt, is like being spoiled, being rotten. That's what God is seeing as he looks down upon the sons of humanity. And there's the phrase again, ain, there is not, oseh tov, doing good. And as if to emphasize it, there is not even one. Now, at this point, you have to ask how much of this is hyperbole and how much is a doctrinal statement. Because Protestant Christians, we know Paul quotes this psalm and other passages in Romans as part of his basically showing Israel, hey, even your own scriptures tell you and me, because Paul was a Jew, even our own scriptures tell us that even among the so-called people of God, there's no one good. That's why whether one's a Jew or a Gentile, they need the gospel. And so Paul quotes from this psalm and other places throughout the Hebrew Bible to show God's people have always been on the receiving end of indictments, along with these Gentiles and the people who act as if there is no God. But the question arises, if there is no one, not even one, then does that include the psalmist? The psalmist who's crying out, is he also implying, or is God implying, yeah, even you have become corrupt as well? Well, theologically, that is the doctrine that the gospel presupposes, that everyone, that other than possibly Enoch, maybe Elijah, everyone has gone astray, and everyone therefore has paid the wages of sin, which is death. So, and that's a doctrinally correct way of reading this psalm. But in the context of this psalm, I don't think you would have to press it that far to feel the impact of this psalm. I think the psalm could recognize there are people on the earth doing good, but this is a lament and this is an emotive song, these lyrics. And so it's speaking hyperbolically. No one does good. They've all turned away. Even though, of course, there is a remnant. Of course, there are people who do seek God, who were alive at the time the psalm was written, including the psalmist. So if you're reading this to get doctrine, then you're going to read this as a doctrinal philosophical statement on human depravity, the universality of the fall. But if you're just reading this as a psalm, I think you don't have to go that far. You can just say, for the purpose of this psalm, the psalmist is looking around and saying, I'm alone. Just like Elijah on Mount Carmel said, it's just me. I'm the only one left. That could be the sense that the psalmist is crying out here. I think the impact works either way, whichever reading you prefer. I think the psalm is still trying to paint a picture of people all around the psalmist who have ruined themselves. The B'nai Adam, the sons of humanity whole collectively, just like back in the time of the flood, have ruined, have soured, have rotted. And that's what the psalmist is lamenting to God. Now, there's an interesting textual variant here in some manuscripts of the Septuagint, not even all of them, but some manuscripts of the Septuagint. There are these lines, this whole section here is added all in verse 3. So if you have a Septuagint, or if you're a Greek Orthodox Christian and you're reading this in your Bible, which is based on Septuagint, verse 3 may be very long. It contains basically everything. When Paul quotes this passage in Romans, there's no one who does good, not even one. In Romans chapter 3, he goes on then to quote a whole bunch of other Old Testament passages that come from different places throughout the Psalms and different Old Testament books. Paul's whole quote of this psalm has been stuck right here in verse 3 in some manuscripts. And so the well-known phrases that, again, these are all elsewhere in the Bible as well, but in some manuscripts it reads, verse 3, no one doing good, not even one. An open grave is their throat. With their tongues they dealt treacherously. Venom of asps is under their lips, whose mouths of cursing and bitterness is full. Swift their feet to shed blood. Destruction and misery in their path, and a way of peace they do not know, nor is fear of God before their eyes. So some manuscript Septuagints had all of this, and like the Latin Vulgate had all of this. But the early manuscripts, and even people going back to the time of Jerome, said, no, that manuscript, this was added by someone trying to harmonize this verse with what Paul had said in Romans. And just so you can see, this is the reader's edition of the Septuagint. Here is this psalm. Remember, in Septuagint, this is Psalm 13 because Psalm 9 and 10 were one psalm in the Septuagint and two in Hebrew. But even in this one, you'll see it has it bracketed. This whole section is put in brackets and it's offset from the text. That's telling the reader, hey, this is not in every Septuagint manuscript. And so in the New English translation of the Septuagint, you come to Psalm 13, which is Psalm 14 in Hebrew. That's what that parenthesis is telling you. And it has the verse. And then at verse 3 is just all turned away. As well, they became useless. There is no one practicing kindness. There is not even one. And it goes on to the next verse. So while some people might argue, no, this is the original and it got left out, it got removed, it's a textual error, whatever. Personally, for what it's worth, I think it's much more likely that in a particular manuscript of the Septuagint when it was being made, someone, a scribe, tried to harmonize or maybe even wrote like a marginal note or something saying when Paul quotes this passage, he continues after saying there's no one who does good, not even one. He continues to give this sort of litany of charges against God's people. And so they put that in this passage. And so this is an addition that was worked its way into the text over the centuries, but that the original reading didn't have this. And all of these phrases that we know from the New Testament, Paul was pulling those from elsewhere in the Old Testament, not in this section. So it's just an aside. It's a text critical issue. Most people don't even notice it. If you've never cracked open an Old Testament that's based on the Septuagint, you wouldn't know that these were missing. If you're used to a translation based on the Septuagint, like I said, maybe you're Orthodox and you're used to it, and then you come to this and you're like, wait, why did they cut out all these verses? That's what's going on. But all of the modern English translations, they don't have it. They all end after no, not one, no, not one, no, not one. And only the Lexham English Septuagint, not the New English translation of the Septuagint, not NETS, but LES. LES puts it here because LES, I believe, is based on Rolf's Septuagint, which is based on, I think, Sinaiticus or whichever manuscript had this section. So if you're reading the Lexham English Septuagint, you're going to see it there. Verse 3 is going to be very long, as you can see here. So that's what's going on, just for those who might be curious. And so it continues, verse 4, Halal yadu, there's the question particle. So this is saying this is a question. Not they know, like do they not know? Don't they know, is how you would say in English. All doers of aven, iniquity. We've seen aven before, wickedness or iniquity. All who are doing iniquity. Don't they know? And then to clarify what doing iniquity means, this le aven, what that consists of, okle ami, those eating my people, literally eating, akal is to eat or to swallow, those eating my people as they eat bread or as they eat food or grain, or is the general word for food, but it specifically means bread. Yahweh not they call upon. So remember back in Genesis during when Seth was born, and at that point it said, and men began to call on the name of the Lord. And this is what those who don't call on the name of the Lord, the wicked, the ones who God looked down at the time of the flood, same thing in the psalmist time, or at least in the lyrics of this psalm, God's looking down again, and they are not calling on Yahweh. And that's what it means to be workers of iniquity. So it's like, don't these workers of iniquity understand? Don't they get it? Don't they know? All these people who are doing iniquity, who are devouring my people as if they were devouring bread, and Yahweh they are not calling upon. Now, whether this my people is God speaking or whether it's the psalmist referring to his people, like the people of Israel and these other nations that are coming against them, I think it works either way. But this phrase, eating my people, it's also found, you're going to see this in Micah. And Rolf Jacobson in his commentary on the Psalms had pointed this out. Says the prophet Micah also employs the metaphor of devouring God's people in a judgment speech against the rulers of Israel. Quote, who eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces, and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like fish in a cauldron. In Micah 3:3. The broader context of Micah helps define the predatory behavior that Psalm 14 condemns by means of the metaphor. So like Psalm 14 is condemning what Micah was also condemning in that passage. What is condemned is the behavior of political and religious leaders who publish glad tidings even though the poor have nothing to eat. And that's Micah 3:5. Or who fail to establish justice for the lowly. Micah 3:9. And that's, I think he's right. I think that's the behavior that's being referred to in the psalm. And we'll get a hint of that in the next couple of verses. But if that's true, then it changes the my people from speaking about Israel collectively or Israel and Judah collectively to who is God's people? If even among the leaders of Israel and Judah, they're devouring these, then who are God's people? And God's people moves from being this national ethnic title to those who are being afflicted and oppressed in their righteousness by evildoers, acting as if there is no God, even within Israel. And so the psalmist looks to the future, looks to God's judgment that will be a day of judgment for the wicked and glorious celebration for those that are being oppressed by the wicked. Verse 5, there, or at that time, or when God comes and does his judgment, there they will tremble a trembling, is how I translated pachdu pachad. It's like in Hebrew, you don't have a dream, you dream a dream. So this one, you don't experience trembling, you tremble a trembling. It's a way that Hebrew works, and it's a very vivid way of expressing it. They will tremble a trembling, because Elohim bador tzadik, because God, in literally it says, in a generation righteous. And so we would say, for God is in a righteous generation, or God is among a righteous generation. God is on the side of a righteous generation. And this translation of dor, generation, it can mean like a generation, like, Gen X or Gen Z or millennial or whatever, but it also can just mean a segment of society. So a righteous generation would be how you would describe people who are righteous in that generation, even if the whole generation itself is not righteous. And so this is why you see the different translations of it. Lexham English, God is with the generation of the righteous, so they leave it pretty literal. NIV, God is present in the company of the righteous. The Tanakh, God is present in the circle of the righteous. ESV, God is with the generation of the righteous. CSB and HCSBs go with God is with those who are righteous. And then it turns to address the evildoers, address the ones who are oppressing. It says, Etzat ani tabishu, the plans or the counsel or the purposes of the needy, the afflicted. We've seen this word before, ani, those who are in need. Their counsels, their plans, their purposes, tabishu. Y'all, this is a plural, y'all put to shame, despised. It's from this word bosh, which means literally to put to shame, but it can be translated despise or even to frustrate or to oppose. You have shamed what the needy are trying to do, their plans, their counsels, the life they're trying to live, what they're seeking. You have despised it. You have shamed it. You have frustrated it. But Yahweh is his refuge. So you are frustrating the plans of the needy. Yahweh is his refuge. The LEB translates the whole thing together. You would put to shame the plan of the poor because Yahweh is his refuge. So it could be translated as that key. This key in Hebrew could be translated as because. So because Yahweh is his refuge, and you say in your heart there is no God, and you see these afflicted people trusting God, you look down on them and you put to shame their desires. You're a smug atheist turning his nose up at these backwards hillbillies who believe in God and trust in God, and you scoff, you mock, you shame them. That could be what this verse is saying. Or NIV, you evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but, and they take key as but, the Lord is their refuge. So in spite of your frustrating their plans, just know that God is their refuge. So it's not saying why the evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, whereas if you translate key as because, then it is saying they're frustrating the plans of the poor because the poor trust in Yahweh. So there's a decision here, and that's what the different translations have to wrestle with. King James goes with because, JPS goes with but. So either way, you've got the poor who are being afflicted and oppressed by the evildoers. So you have the poor on one side, and they're trusting in God. And you have the evildoers on the other side who are afflicting the poor, and they're just living life as if there is no God. No one to hold them accountable. Their strength is their God. Their ingenuity is their God. Their intellect is their God. And so they live how they want. And then we come to the last verse. Mi yetain mitzion Yeshuath Yisrael. Literally, who will give or will appoint, or Natan just means to put, to give, to place, to set. Who will bring forth, set from Zion, the salvation or deliverance, Yeshua. This is the name that Joshua in the Old Testament, Jesus in the New Testament, Yeshua, salvation of Yisrael. Who will give from Zion the salvation of Israel? And Zion is the word for Jerusalem, the place of the Temple Mount. So it could be talking about either salvation coming from the temple. At this point, if David wrote this, it would have been a tabernacle not located in Zion, but Zion became David's city. So it could be talking about the Messiah, the King of Israel, like who will come and rescue, which no coincidence that Yeshua is the one who will come from Zion, bring forth the Yeshuath Yisrael. If you're a Christian reader, then you look at this and you cannot help but see gospel foreshadowing in it. But it's not a predictive prophecy. And I think it'd be too much to push it in that direction to try to convince somebody that this is talking about Jesus. But it sure is interesting that the psalmist cries out, who will place or give from Zion salvation of Israel? And then you have Jesus on the cross in Zion, and that salvation then goes out to the ends of the earth. So anyway, that's how early Christians would have obviously read this passage. But the psalmist, BC, is saying who will, and this could also be translated as like, oh, that someone would bring forth from Zion salvation for Israel. And that's how a lot of the modern translations handle it. Even Lexham English, which is pretty woodenly literal, says, oh, that from Zion would come salvation for Israel. NIV, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. King James, oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion. So the only one that keeps the question as a question is the Lexham English Septuagint. Septuagint, who will give from Zion the salvation of Israel? And then the final words, this is a little bit tricky. It says literally, in to return Yahweh the captivity of his people. And we would translate in English, when he turns or returns or restores. Shuv can have all of these mean. It just means to turn, change things from facing one way to facing another way. So when God, Yahweh, when Yahweh turns Shavuth Amo, the captivity of his people. When he does that, the final words, Yagel Yaakov, he will shout, Jacob will shout for joy. Yismach Yisrael, Israel will rejoice. And you can hear there's some assonance going on. Yagel Yaakov, Yishmach Yisrael. It doesn't flow as smoothly in English, but no poetry does when you translate it. But Jacob will shout for joy, Israel will rejoice. When God overturns the captivity of his people. Now, some people have looked at this and they've said, the captivity of his people, this must have been written during the exile. And that's possible. I mean, Psalm scholars think this is, it's a psalm of David, but it's a psalm in the manner of David, not necessarily written by David. And it's talking, or at least this last verse, some have even said this last verse was added during the exile to what was originally a Davidic lament, which ended at verse 6, but there's no textual evidence for that. It's just a theory based on the content. But this Shuvat Imo, it could refer to the captivity of his people in exile, but it could also refer to the captivity of his people to these evildoers in that generation. It could just be a metaphorical captivity. My people are being eaten like they eat bread. That's a metaphor, and this could be that same metaphor, the captivity of my people, that injustice that Micah was talking about, the devouring of that could also, it just could be two metaphors for oppression of people who are seeking refuge in God by people who live as if there is no God. So I think either makes sense. I think that's the beauty of this psalm is, could this be sung by the captives in exile? Absolutely. And it would have taken on a whole new meaning. Could it be sung by people in David's generation who were being oppressed by the surrounding nations? Absolutely. And it would take on that meaning. Could it be sung by people later in Israel's kingdom who were being oppressed by their own leaders and by the rich in their society getting ahead at their expense? Could they have sung this? Yes, I think it could have worked for them as well. Could it work today for people who are facing oppression in a world where everyone is living as if Ein Elohim, there is no God? Yes. It can work. So that's the beauty of this song, is you don't have to tie it to a specific historical situation for the message to be clear. Now, this psalm is going to be repeated almost verbatim later in the Psalms. With only a couple of small changes, this song is basically going to make a reappearance. And we'll talk about that when we get there, whenever that will be, because I think it's in the 50s somewhere. But this is one of the Psalms theologically that Paul, when he was looking back into the Hebrew Bible. And he was trying to combat the notion that some Jews of his day, his fellow Jews, might say, well, yeah, that gospel you're preaching is for those sinning Gentiles, those idolatrous pagans. Of course, they need the gospel, but we don't need the gospel. We have Abraham as our father. And so Paul is taking in Romans, he's going to take readers back through this catena of Old Testament references and say, you haven't read your scriptures very well if you think that just being Abraham's descendants is enough. Even if you think being part of the tribe of Judah that didn't go astray like the northern kingdom did and was brought back after the exile, unlike the northern kingdom tribes, even if you think that that's the club you're in, don't think that that's going to save you, because our own scriptures tell us that there is no one who does good, that we have all gone astray. And he's going to give that, again, just the litany of indictments against Israel from Israel's scriptures to show that whether Israelite, whether Jew, whether Gentile, everyone stands in need of the salvation of Israel, the Yeshua Yisrael. So that's Psalm 14. I hope this was interesting, and I hope it just makes the psalm take on a little more life as you're reading and studying it. That's the goal of this playlist. If you haven't seen previous entries, maybe this is the first Disciple Dojo video you're seeing, click on the playlist button here on YouTube, tap on it on your phone or click on it on your laptop or wherever you're watching this, and we have an entire playlist with all of the Psalms that we've covered so far. We also have playlists that teach through the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. We're going to be doing other books as well. So just take a look here at Disciple Dojo. The goal is to create an archived library of teaching resources that are absolutely free, available to anyone, anywhere on the planet who has internet access and can understand my language. Of course, with AI and translation stuff, I think pretty soon you'll be able to watch this in any language and catch a transcript, but that's in the future. All of this is possible because Disciple Dojo is supported by generous monthly donors, by the way. Our YouTube revenue is like a fraction of what it costs to actually run this ministry. So if you would like to tangibly help this type of teaching continue, then take a look at our donor page over at our website, discipledojo.org/donate. Just take a look at what we're about. And if you're like, yeah, I actually want to help and partner with you on a monthly basis and give financially any amount you're able, that would be great and very, very much appreciated. So that'll do it for now. Next time, we're going to take a look at Psalm 15 and just continue on this journey through Israel's hymn book. So stay tuned. And in the meantime, as always, keep training.